The lake shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its surface rippling gently as a light breeze danced across the water. For decades, the lake had been a cherished retreat for anglers and boaters alike. Nestled at the heart of an upscale neighborhood, it was a place where families gathered on weekends, where children learned to fish, and where local traditions thrived. But, beneath its peaceful exterior, tensions had begun to simmer. The Homeowners Association prided itself on maintaining order, claiming to protect the beauty and harmony of the community. Rules were strict and often enforced with an iron fist, especially by a handful of members who took their roles a little too seriously. Among them was Karen, a woman known for her sharp eyes, sharper tongue, and an obsession with control. Karen saw herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, always ready to pounce on anything she deemed out of line. One quiet morning, Karen noticed something unusual, a sleek, dark-colored boat moored near the far edge of the lake. It wasn't a cheap inflatable kayak or an ordinary fishing dinghy. No, this was an elegant boat, well-maintained and stylish, the kind you'd expect to see on a private estate. Karen's eyes narrowed as curiosity quickly turned into indignation. She didn't recognize the boat, nor the man who was calmly seated inside, casting his fishing line into the water as if he owned the place. The man was tall, with a calm demeanor and an air of quiet confidence. His presence unsettled Karen for reasons she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the fact that he didn't seem intimidated by her watchful gaze from the shore, nor did he acknowledge her disapproving glare. To Karen, this was a blatant challenge to HOA authority, and she wasn't about to let it slide. The HOA had strict regulations. Residents were allowed small paddle boats, provided they were registered. No motorized boats. No unapproved guests. And absolutely no exceptions. This stranger was breaking every rule in the book, or so Karen assumed. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and started making calls. Within minutes, a small group of HOA loyalists had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some were curious, others annoyed, but all shared Karen's conviction that the man had no business being there. From the edge of the water, Karen barked out instructions to the group, pointing at the man in the boat like he was a trespasser on sacred ground. What Karen didn't know was that this quiet man wasn't just some visitor ignoring the rules. He had a deeper connection to this lake than anyone present could possibly imagine, a truth that would soon unravel every assumption they held. The man, oblivious to, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the growing crowd, remained focused on his fishing line. His movements were steady, deliberate, almost serene. For him, the lake wasn't just water surrounded by homes. It was history, heritage, and something he had fought to preserve. As Karen continued her rant, promising to call security and even the police if necessary, whispers spread among the onlookers. Who was this man? Why did he seem so unbothered? And why, despite Karen's escalating aggression, did he not even flinch? By the time the sun began to dip behind the trees, Karen had worked herself into a frenzy. To her, this was no longer about a boat. It was about authority, respect, and control. She vowed then and there that the man would regret challenging the HOA. Little did she know, the storm she was about to unleash would not only shatter her illusion of power but would also expose truths that would turn the entire neighborhood upside down. And so, as darkness settled over the lake, two forces were set on a collision course, one driven by entitlement and control. The other by quiet strength and undeniable ownership. The calm waters of the lake would soon become the epicenter of a battle that no one in the neighborhood would ever forget. The next morning, Karen arrived at the lake before sunrise, determined to catch the mysterious man red-handed. She had barely slept, her mind consumed with thoughts of HOA bylaws and what she saw as blatant disrespect. For Karen, this wasn't just about a boat anymore, it was personal. As the first rays of sunlight spread across the water, Karen spotted the same sleek boat gliding through the lake's calm surface. The man sat at the stern, casting his line into the water with effortless grace. He looked just as calm as the day before, if not more so, and that infuriated Karen. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not in her own neighborhood. With a determined stride, Karen marched to the edge of the lake, her HOA badge hanging from her neck like a medal of honor. Behind her trailed two other committee members, Linda and Greg, who had reluctantly agreed to back her up. They weren't as passionate about enforcement as Karen, but they knew better than to get in her way when she was on a mission. Karen cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted across the water, her voice echoing off the houses nearby. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. He just kept fishing, his movements slow and deliberate, as though the outburst never happened. Karen's blood boiled. How dare he ignore her, she called out again, louder this time, and still received no response. That was all the confirmation she needed. This man wasn't just a rule breaker, he was a troublemaker. Pulling out her phone, Karen began recording a video, narrating her outrage for the HOA group chat. Her words dripped with indignation as she documented evidence of the violation, promising swift action against what she called an intruder. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Residents peeked out from their patios, some even walking down to the shoreline to see what the commotion was about. Karen thrived on attention, and this growing audience fueled her determination. She launched into a lecture about HOA rules, her voice rising with every word, while the man continued fishing in silence. Eventually, the boat glided closer to shore, not because of Karen's yelling, but because the man had finished his round on the lake. He reeled in his line with calm precision, secured his catch in a small container, and began tying the boat to a private dock near a section of land that most residents assumed was community property. Karen seized the moment. She stormed toward him, ignoring the damp grass under her expensive shoes. In her mind, this was the ultimate showdown, the HOA against an outsider. She stopped just short of the dock, glaring at the man as he climbed out of the boat. He moved with an air of quiet authority, his posture upright and unshaken. When his eyes finally met hers, there was no anger, no defensiveness, just a calm confidence that Karen found strangely unnerving. Before she could launch into her tirade, something unusual caught her attention, the sign posted at the edge of the dock. It wasn't the standard HOA signage. This one looked official, engraved with bold letters that read, "Private property, no trespassing without owner's permission." Karen froze for a brief moment, her mind racing. The sign wasn't familiar. In fact, she didn't recall the HOA ever approving it. Brushing off the thought, she continued her verbal assault, demanding the man remove his boat immediately and report to the HOA office for a fine. The man listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finally finished, he spoke in a calm, even tone. His words were few, but they hit like a thunderclap. "I'm not violating anything. This is my lake." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Karen blinked in disbelief, her brain scrambling to process what she had just heard. His lake? That couldn't be true. The HOA managed this lake, didn't they? It was part of the community, part of their rules and regulations. Wasn't it? Karen's confidence faltered, but only for a second. She laughed, loud and dismissive, brushing off his statement as arrogance. But deep down, a sliver of doubt began to creep in. What if he wasn't lying? What if the lake didn't belong to the HOA after all? Whispers rippled through the small crowd behind her. Some residents exchanged curious glances, while others pulled out their phones to search property records. Karen felt the control slipping from her grasp, and she hated it. As the man turned and began walking toward a small cabin on the edge of the water, a cabin Karen had never noticed before, she realized this was far from over. If he was telling the truth, everything she believed about the HOA's authority over the lake was about to unravel. Karen clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't back down. Not now. She would dig up every document, every deed, every legal clause if she had to. There was no way some outsider was going to undermine her authority. But what Karen didn't know was that the man wasn't an outsider at all. His connection to this lake ran deeper than any of them could imagine. And soon, his ownership would be more than just words, it would become a weapon that would dismantle the HOA's grip on the community. Karen spent the entire night digging through HOA records, convinced that the mysterious man's claim was nothing more than a bluff. She flipped through binders of meeting notes, scanned digital archives, and called every committee member she could think of. But no matter how deep she searched, one glaring fact became impossible to ignore: nowhere in the HOA's documents was there any mention of ownership of the lake. The bylaws spoke about community usage and shared maintenance, but not a single page explicitly claimed the HOA owned the water or the land around it. That realization sent a chill down Karen's spine. If the HOA didn't own the lake, who did? Meanwhile, the man at the center of the storm, whose name was Marcus, remained calm and collected. For him, the uproar wasn't surprising. Over the years, he had seen how quickly people assumed power they didn't have. But Marcus had never been one to seek confrontation. He loved the lake, not the drama. Still, Karen's relentless aggression had crossed a line, and now it was time to set the record straight. Marcus had inherited the lake from his grandfather, a man who had purchased the land decades before the neighborhood even existed. At the time, the area was nothing more than open countryside, with the lake serving as a family retreat. When developers came in and built the surrounding homes, they worked out an easement agreement that allowed residents limited access to the water, for recreational purposes only. That access never included ownership. Marcus knew all of this because the deed, the title, and the original agreements were locked safely in his home office. He rarely brought it up because most residents respected the space, and for years, the informal arrangement worked. But now, Karen had pushed things too far. By mid-morning, the neighborhood buzzed with speculation. Whispers about the lake's ownership had spread like wildfire. Some residents were shocked, others amused, and a few were secretly thrilled at the thought of Karen being wrong. Screens lit up with property searches, and sure enough, every public record pointed to the same truth: the lake wasn't HOA property, it belonged to Marcus Carter. The news hit the HOA like a sledgehammer. Karen, however, refused to accept it. She called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, rallying the committee and any resident willing to listen. She spun the situation as a misunderstanding, promising that the HOA's legal team would clear things up. But as she spoke, the doubt in her voice betrayed her confidence. While Karen clung to denial, Marcus prepared his own response, not out of spite, but necessity. If the HOA could attempt to dictate what he did on his own property, what would stop them from trying to enforce more rules in the future? It wasn't about a boat anymore, it was about boundaries, both legal and personal. That afternoon, Marcus walked into the HOA meeting, holding a thick folder in his hand. The room fell silent as every head turned toward him. Karen's eyes flashed with a mix of anger and panic, but she forced a smile, trying to maintain control. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By evening, every resident knew the truth: the lake was not community property, and it never had been. The revelation shattered years of assumptions, leaving the HOA scrambling for answers and Karen seething with embarrassment. Karen's usual allies were starting to distance themselves, their confidence in her leadership shaken. Some even whispered about replacing her as head of the HOA. But Karen wasn't ready to let go of control. She doubled down, insisting Marcus was misinterpreting the documents and that the HOA still had authority to regulate lake usage. Her words sounded hollow, and deep down, she knew it. While Karen clung to denial, Marcus was making plans of his own. He had tolerated the HOA's overreach for too long, believing that staying quiet would avoid unnecessary conflict. But the confrontation had changed everything. Karen's attempt to humiliate him had made one thing clear: if he didn't establish firm boundaries now, they would keep testing his limits. The first thing Marcus did was consult his attorney. He laid out every detail: the deed, the easement agreement, the recent incident, and asked what options he had. The lawyer's advice was straightforward: Marcus had full control over the lake and the surrounding property. The HOA had no legal standing to enforce any rule there. Marcus could, if he wanted, revoke all easement privileges and restrict access entirely. It was a heavy decision, but Marcus knew it had to be done. For years, he had allowed the community to fish, boat, and host small gatherings on the water as a courtesy. Now, that courtesy had been weaponized against him. He wasn't about to let that happen again. The next morning, Marcus began taking action. Contractors arrived at the property, unloading lumber, metal posts, and heavy machinery. By noon, a crew was erecting a sturdy fence along the shoreline, starting at the section closest to Karen's house. Bright, "No trespassing" signs went up every few feet, and a locked gate was installed on the only path leading to the private dock. The sight of construction sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Residents gathered in clusters, watching with wide eyes as Marcus's property transformed into a clearly defined private zone. Murmurs filled the air, some expressed outrage, others sympathy, and a few quietly applauded Marcus for standing his ground. Karen, however, was livid. She stormed out of her house, marching straight to the construction site with her phone recording. She barked accusations at Marcus, claiming his actions violated community spirit and promising to call the police. Marcus didn't argue. He simply handed her a copy of the easement agreement and told her, in the same calm tone as before, that her HOA had abused its privileges. Effective immediately, those privileges were revoked. Karen's face turned crimson as reality sank in. Not only had she failed to assert control, but her actions had cost the entire neighborhood access to the lake. For years, residents had enjoyed fishing, boating, and summer barbecues by the water. Now, those days were over, and everyone knew who to blame. By sunset, the construction crew had finished the first phase of the barrier. The lake was no longer an open playground for the HOA, it was Marcus's private retreat once again. To make things crystal clear, Marcus sent a formal notice to every homeowner, explaining the legal situation in detail and outlining new rules. All fishing rights are revoked. No HOA events will be allowed on the lake or its shores. Unauthorized entry will be treated as trespassing and prosecuted accordingly. The notice was polite but firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Marcus wasn't seeking revenge, he was enforcing boundaries. But to the HOA, and especially to Karen, it felt like a crushing defeat. That night, Karen sat in her living room, fuming as she scrolled through the neighborhood message board. Post after post criticized her for pushing Marcus too far. Residents who had once supported her were now calling for her resignation. Every word felt like a dagger, but Karen refused to give in. She told herself this wasn't over, not yet. What Karen didn't realize was that her next move would be the final nail in the coffin. In a desperate attempt to regain control, she would make a mistake so reckless that it would cost the HOA more than just access to the lake, it would destroy the very foundation of their authority. The neighborhood was in chaos. Residents who once praised Karen for her strict enforcement were now turning on her. Social media groups buzzed with anger, memes mocking her leadership spread like wildfire, and petitions to remove her as HOA president began circulating. Karen felt the walls closing in. For Karen, losing control was never an option. Her identity revolved around being the one who kept the neighborhood in order. The thought of Marcus, the man she had publicly tried to humiliate, now standing victorious, was unbearable. Every time she looked out her window and saw those bright, "No trespassing" signs, it felt like a personal insult, a constant reminder of her failure. Desperation pushed Karen into reckless territory. She began researching property laws, convinced she could find a loophole to reclaim authority. Her late nights were spent poring over outdated statutes and calling anyone who might give her legal advice. But the answer was always the same: Marcus owned the lake outright. The HOA had no jurisdiction. Still, Karen refused to accept defeat. That's when an idea, bold, dangerous, and completely irrational, took root in her mind. If legal channels couldn't restore control, maybe pressure could. If she could make Marcus's life miserable enough, perhaps he'd reconsider his stance or even sell the lake property altogether. Karen started small, weaponizing HOA bylaws against Marcus's primary residence, which bordered the lake. She issued petty violation notices: grass height too long, mailbox paint slightly chipped, a garden ornament not community compliant. Each notice carried a fine, and each fine was a shot fired in her one-woman war. But Marcus didn't react. He paid no attention to the notices because he knew something Karen either ignored or forgot: the HOA's authority ended at the property line. His lakefront home was entirely outside HOA jurisdiction, just like the lake. Her letters went straight into the shredder, and her fines were worthless. That only fueled Karen's rage. She escalated further, rallying a handful of die-hard supporters and launching a smear campaign against Marcus. Whispered rumors circulated about his character, his past, and even his finances. Karen thought that if she couldn't beat him legally, she'd turn the neighborhood against him socially. But Karen underestimated two things: Marcus's resilience and the residents' growing resentment toward her antics. People had enjoyed years of peaceful coexistence by the lake. Now, thanks to Karen's obsession, that privilege was gone. Families who loved weekend fishing trips were angry, and the HOA's reputation was in freefall. Then came the breaking point. One humid afternoon, Karen decided to confront Marcus on his property. Ignoring every legal and moral boundary, she marched past the "no trespassing" signs and onto his dock, her phone recording as she spewed accusations about selfishness and destroying community spirit. She demanded he take down the fence, threatening legal action and even hinting at making things difficult for him in ways she didn't fully explain. What Karen didn't realize was that Marcus's security cameras were rolling, capturing every word, every step, and every sign she ignored. When Karen left, smug and satisfied that she'd made her point, Marcus calmly forwarded the footage to his attorney. Within 48 hours, Karen received a letter that would make her blood run cold: a formal notice of trespassing, along with a warning that any future incidents would result in criminal charges. The letter was firm but polite, citing state laws and including still images from the security footage as evidence. When Karen read the letter, her hands trembled. She had gone too far, and Marcus had the upper hand in every possible way. But instead of backing down, she made one final, catastrophic move. She called an emergency HOA meeting and convinced the board to allocate funds for a lawsuit against Marcus, claiming public easement rights and community interest. It was a desperate gamble, one that drained thousands of dollars from the HOA's budget. Karen envisioned herself marching into court and reclaiming victory. But reality hit like a freight train when the judge dismissed the case in the very first hearing, ruling unequivocally in Marcus's favor. The easement agreement, signed decades ago, was ironclad. The HOA had no claim, no authority, and now, no money. The neighborhood erupted in outrage. Dues skyrocketed to cover legal costs, and residents who once stayed neutral now demanded Karen's immediate resignation. Her name became synonymous with failure, and the whispers about removing her turned into open calls for her ousting. As Karen sat alone in the HOA office that evening, staring at the stacks of angry letters and refund demands, she realized her empire had crumbled. Her quest for control had cost her everything: her reputation, her position, and the trust of the very community she claimed to protect. But the story wasn't over. Marcus, while calm and collected throughout, had one final announcement that would ensure Karen's name lived in infamy and the HOA never crossed him again. The HOA was in ruins. Karen had officially resigned under mounting pressure from furious residents, leaving her once commanding presence reduced to whispers and ridicule. The lawsuit debacle had drained the HOA's emergency fund, forcing the board to announce steep increases in dues to cover the loss. Families who had once supported Karen were now united in outrage, their anger aimed squarely at the leadership that had allowed one woman's obsession to spiral out of control. Meanwhile, Marcus observed everything from a distance with quiet composure. He hadn't celebrated his victory, nor had he gloated when Karen's downfall became inevitable. His goal had never been revenge, it was about respect and boundaries. But even with Karen gone, Marcus knew the HOA might try again someday. So, he decided to end the issue permanently, in a way that no one would ever forget. A week after Karen's resignation, every homeowner received an elegant, cream-colored envelope in the mail. Inside was a formal letter from Marcus, printed on professional letterhead. The message was brief but carried weight like a hammer striking steel. Effective immediately, all prior easement agreements regarding access to the lake are permanently revoked. The lake and its surrounding property are strictly private. No fishing, boating, swimming, or gatherings will be permitted. Any violations will result in prosecution for trespassing under state law. The letter closed with a single line that silenced any lingering doubts. Ownership documents are on file with the county clerk's office. The impact was instant. Group chats exploded, voices rising in anger and disbelief. Decades of casual access to the lake vanished overnight. Families who once planned weekend fishing trips had to explain to their kids that those days were gone. The HOA scrambled to calm residents, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and everyone knew who caused it, Karen and her relentless crusade. But Marcus wasn't finished. A week later, contractors returned to the lakefront, bringing with them heavy machinery and building materials. Over the next several weeks, the quiet shoreline transformed into something new. A tall, reinforced perimeter fence enclosed the property, topped with security cameras at every corner. Access gates were locked, and the only signs visible from the neighborhood read: "Private property, violators will be prosecuted." The final blow came in the form of a massive announcement posted online and in local newspapers. Marcus had partnered with a luxury real estate developer to convert part of his land into an exclusive private fishing and boating club, with membership fees starting at an eye-watering amount. Invitations would go out to select individuals, none of whom lived in the HOA community. The message was clear: the lake was no longer a shared treasure. It was now a premium privilege, reserved for those who respected ownership and boundaries. The HOA's fishing club, once a point of neighborhood pride, was officially dead. For the residents, it was a bitter pill to swallow. Some blamed Marcus, but most knew the truth: this was Karen's doing. Her arrogance and hunger for control had cost them something priceless. Her name became a cautionary tale, a whispered warning about what happens when power goes unchecked. As for Karen, she vanished from the neighborhood's social circles. Her house, once the center of activity, sat eerily quiet. Rumors swirled that she was selling and moving away, unable to face the humiliation that had followed her every step. Marcus, on the other hand, continued living peacefully by the water he had always cherished. He spent his mornings fishing in solitude, the lake reflecting the golden glow of sunrise, a private sanctuary, free from HOA interference forever. And so, the story ended where it began, with a man and his boat on a tranquil lake. But this time, there were no angry shouts, no HOA meetings. And no Karen waving rule books. Just calm waters, absolute ownership, and a neighborhood that had learned a costly lesson about power, entitlement, and respect.